So this image that you see up on the screen, our own Clara Matheny, who's back there on the camera and who helps set up the camera work every Sunday. Turns out one day I was just watching over her shoulder and she was drawing something, and then I asked her to send me some of her other stuff, and was really pretty impressed with just that sort of casual animation style. So we talked on about Wednesday, I think, this week, and I told her I might want her to design something. Can we go to the next slide, Philip, and see it more holy? There we go. Okay, that's it completely. And all I had said to her was, I had said, listen, I'm going to talk about Easter and resurrection. I don't know what that means to you, but I'm also going to play with the idea of the three parts of the magic trick. And so I just sort of described the overall theme, and then Thursday afternoon she sent me this image. And y'all take a look at that. Yes, absolutely, yeah. Pretty impressive. And so that changed my sermon. No, it actually didn't. It was surprising how much it overlapped with it, and I just love the serendipity and kind of coincidences that allow that things happen in this service. And the reason why it happens really is because of creativity. Anytime you allow creativity to be the process, anytime you allow collaboration and openness and creativity without too much defined boundaries, things can blossom and flourish, and unexpected things can arise. Because at the very ground of our being is this thing called creativity, or you might want to call it love, or some of you might want to call it God. There's a lot of ways to think about this. So this morning I want to think with you a little bit about Easter and resurrection and what it means to you and what it means to me. And I'll start off with this little story. A church pastor was with her daughter and the neighbor and their daughter, and the two little 5-year-old girls were out playing in the front yard. They'd just been to church that morning, and the pastor's daughter, she had seen her mom do a baptism and thought that was amazing. So she and her friend were over there playing kind of with the hose and running around in the yard when the little girl, the pastor's daughter, looked at her friend and said, "I'm going to baptize you. Let's play baptism." And so the little girl said, "Great." Meanwhile, the two parents are talking. The little girl went over to the faucet and she said, "But before I can do it, I've got to make the water holy." And so she put her hands over the faucet and she said some kind of illegible, nonsensical incantation. Then she picked up the hose and turned on the water just enough to let it trickle, brought her friend over, and then let the water trickle over her head, like she'd seen her mom baptize the little baby. And so she let the water trickle over, and as her friend stood there with her eyes closed, the water went over her face, and it went into her mouth, and immediately her eyes went wide, and she licked her lips, and she looked at her friend, and she said, "Oh my gosh, holy water tastes just like regular water." I often think about my first Bible class when I think about this time of year. It was in college. I was still mind and emotions deep in fundamentalism and evangelical church. I was attending University of Texas at Austin. So I decided to up my intellectual spiritual game by taking an Intro to New Testament course. Now, being a secular college, they usually involved adjunct professors. They found pastors to teach who had advanced degrees. And so ours was a UCC pastor who had a PhD in New Testament. He taught the class at his church right off the campus, a UCC church. And so I was there taking the class. And I remember it around this time of year because my final paper was a defense of the physical resurrection of Jesus. Something which I thought at the time was the most important, all-important thing that you had to be or had to understand or believe in order to be a Christian. I got a C. Made no sense to me. I had the perfect defense, and I got a C. So I went to see him that afternoon, and I met with Dr. Cox, and this is what he said. I was pretty upset, and he says, "I've got two questions that I want to ask you." He said, "This is the first question. If the physical resuscitation of a body is what was really so important about Easter, then why aren't there a bunch of Lazarenes walking around?" Because Lazarus was raised, right? Or even in Jesus' day. There were lots of resurrection stories in Jesus' time. Why didn't they get a following? He says, "I've got a second question. If that's the case, if it wasn't about that, what compelled people to give their lives to follow this man's ideas who had just been executed as a criminal? What made it more than just another amazing magic trick that it would last and grow for 2,000 years? He set these two diametrically opposed questions for me, right? If it was a resuscitation, why aren't there all sorts of followers of all the other resuscitation stories? Which effectively sort of negates the idea. And then he turns around and he says, if it's not a resuscitation, why are there thousands and thousands of people that continue for thousands of years to grow and grow and grow after following this criminal who was executed? He just left both of those diametrically opposed questions in my head and said, you still get your C. But now you got two great questions. And those questions stayed with me, and they have stayed with me. And being with Dr. Cox turned our lives around. Also turned my wife Linda's around. We both took that class. Some of you will remember how she had this experience where she was on the campus, and both of us still being sort of fundamentalists in our mindset. And so as we were walking across the Western Plaza, where a lot of the various school clubs and whatnot would have their tables and exhibits, that's where we were walking up, and we noticed that there was the LGBTQ table. This was back in the 70s, in the mid-late 70s. There was that table with members of that club, and Linda and I stopped because who was sitting at the table with them? But of course, Dr. Cox, the pastor of the UCC church, taking information and handing out information. Dr. Cox changed our lives. Dr. Cox changed how we looked at everything. When I was 6 years old, I was living in San Antonio. My mother decided to throw a birthday party for me, invite all our friends, and she hired a magician. Now, I never liked magic because I never trusted stuff disappearing. I just didn't like it disappearing. And even when it reappeared, it was like, no, I don't like that at all. But she hired a magician thinking I would enjoy it. And so all the other kids were having a lot of fun, and the magician took a rabbit. He took his black hat, the top hat. It was pretty large. He reached in and pulled a rabbit out of the hat. It was an empty hat first. He showed it to all of us, an empty hat, right? We kind of all knew where this was going. It was sort of like the ubiquitous magic trick, but still it was interesting to watch. But he did this in a different way. He actually took the empty hat, pulled a rabbit out. Cute little bunny. Then he gave it to us as we played with the rabbit. And we all pet the rabbit, and he ran around a little bit. And about 2 minutes later, the magician picked up the rabbit, and he put it back in the hat, waved his hands around, and the rabbit was gone. And some of the kids were looking at him going, why'd you take the rabbit away? What'd you do with the rabbit? And pretty soon the little crowd was kind of falling apart because we liked the bunny, and he made the bunny disappear. He promised, I'll bring it back. Don't worry, I'll bring the bunny back. He did some other magic things and was moving around, and I'm going like, nah, No, he put the hat back behind a little partition. We were standing on the floor in our den, and we had a big open clearing there. And so I snuck around while everyone else was sort of looking this way. I snuck around and looked for the hat. And sure enough, I picked it up, and it was heavy. I looked inside it and put my hand just pushing for why it was so heavy at the bottom, and a little partition opened up. And there was the bunny, which had been there the whole time. So I took it with the partition covered. I went back out in the middle of his trick, and he stopped, and he looked at me, and I said, look, no bunny. And then I opened it up and said, bunny. It was here the whole time. And whereas I thought, to my surprise, that they were all going to be upset the magician had just duped them all, they were just glad to see a bunny was alive. Then they smiled and said, do more magic. I think part of the challenge at Easter, at least for me, but especially for a culture that I think is increasing in our world, but especially in the West, this culture of the non-religious, this culture of the none of the aboves. On the Gallup poll, the most recent Gallup poll that came out this year showed that the none of the aboves, the non-religious, the non-religiously affiliated, actually outnumber Catholics and evangelicals. It's now the largest and fastest growing religious denomination. The non-religious, the none of the aboves, nothing to do with any of those folks. That's now the fastest growing denomination. And I think a big part of it is because of some of the magical thinking, as well as some of the tradition that just doesn't make sense. It doesn't resonate with the world. And I think the challenge, for me at least, and maybe for you too, is to put some kind of understanding that can make sense out of this idea of resurrection. I would venture to say that for many people, Easter continues to be a celebration of some great feat of God to bring a dead man back to life. And if God can do that, then God can do some pretty amazing things. God can put life back in order. God can make painful things go away. God can line me up with the best partner ever. God can fix my illnesses. God can make things better in the world. And if those of us who remember the Apostles' Creed, we say we believe in the Catholic Church, the resurrection of the body. It's a part of that old 4th century thinking that the church in many places still recites every week. But now when we start thinking about what God can do for us, we start sounding just like the Jews who were around Jesus when he entered into Jerusalem at the early part of Holy Week. And all of the folks were waving their fans and their palm leaves as Caesar entered in on the other side, because here was the real ruler. Here was the conquering hero. Here was Jesus, the Savior, Messiah, who was going to take care of the Roman Empire and fix the world for us. And Jesus stopped in the midst of all that, looked to the crowd that was around him and said, "If you only knew of the things that really make for peace." And then he continued on, leaving it to us to try to figure it out. Easter isn't a magic trick. Easter, I think, is the essence of who we are. It isn't about pulling Jesus out of a tomb. It's about God who was never not there to begin with. It was about God and in the midst of our creation who was never not present at the very ground of our being from the very beginning. So that resurrection isn't about something new happening, it's about something we start to see. It's about us learning to see life differently. It's about us opening up, like the character of Love who confronted Howard. Howard, you can't live without it. I didn't go away, I'm in everything. The good, the bad, the ugly, the happy, the beautiful. But you have to open to it. You have to let it in. And then she reminds him, don't try to live without love. It's ultimately, I think, what moved a small band of followers to become a worldwide movement. Because love simply can't be killed. It can be ignored, it can be denied, it can be shut out, but it cannot be destroyed. It was here in the beginning and has always been here. And it will continue in us, and it will continue in spite of us. The real message of Easter is that nothing was turned, nothing was changed that hadn't already been there all along. But Jesus lived a life to the point of being executed for a life that reminded us the ground of our being is love. The purpose of our being is love. And it's not about some belief in the inherent meaning of all things. Rather, it's living as if all ordinary things are truly extraordinary. Resurrection is not a passive affirmation. It's about risking the trust and the vulnerability that it often takes to experience the density and depth of love that is operating through all things. And it's difficult in times of pain. It's difficult in times of loss. It's difficult in times of challenge, when things aren't going right, when things don't go the way we expect them to go, when the world seems to be falling apart in times. It's difficult to imagine that we don't need God to change it. But it's not magic. It's at the very ground of our being. And it requires us to take those risks in the face of love, to take the risk to love in the face of challenges and pain. Resurrection is what challenges death, violence, darkness, and what transforms the world. It was interesting. You remember what Jesus said when he was talking about the goats and the sheep in the parable, and those who fed the hungry, clothed the poor, helped those in prison. Those were the ones that experienced the kingdom of God. And they were saying, like, when did we ever do that? We didn't see you. When did we ever see you? And he says, well, every time you did that, you were doing it to me. But we've always had the poor. We've always had people in pain. We've always had people who do wrong. We've always had hunger. So what do you mean now we're seeing you? It's because the magic is that it was never gone. It was always there, and it's always been there, and it's always at the source of who we are. And until we become small and allow love to become large, then life continues on as it has. And a lot of folks still looking for the magic, when the magic's in us. The magic's in you. I think there's a song called The Magic's in You. Isn't that right, Brad? There's a song like that? We could have done that one. There's nothing in forgiving somebody 70 times 7, right? That's magic. There's nothing magic in that. Forgive someone 70 times 7, Jesus told them. Try to experience empathy with your enemy, Jesus told them. Love your enemy. There's nothing magic in all of that. Band, I forgot to let y'all come on back up now. This is your cue to come on up. There's nothing magic in that forgiving everyone. There's nothing magic in trying to love your enemies. There's nothing magic in feeding the poor, in giving something up of yourself in order to make room for others to experience the depth of life, to move yourself out of the way a little bit. Is there magic in that? And yet, the world changes. The world becomes something better. And here's what you might even suddenly realize as a surprise. That when we do open up and get ourselves out of the way, we get changed too. We start to experience something larger. Love is not magic. Love is simply what moves the world. And when we can open up and participate in that, we are participating in resurrection. Keira Knightley's character says, don't try to live without it. What was it that Rumi said? Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that we keep building against it. Right? This is resurrection. This is how we remember who we are and how we draw upon the very source of what our being is and how we ultimately find our best selves in creating the kingdom of love. Don't try to live without it because it's who we